Hi, I'm Dr. Josh Matthews. So what makes the movie Citizen Kane great? Citizen Kane is one of those movies that a lot of people think they just need to see because it's supposedly great. Kane has been near the top of best movies lists from critics and viewers and directors for over 60 years. But it's actually a hard movie to watch. I say that based on experience showing this to college students. A majority of them aren't warm to it when they watch it. It usually takes me 3 to 4 class periods as it start to open up some of the reasons why Kane ought to be watched, why it's so complex and interesting, and why someone could appreciate it even if they didn't like it. Now, I think in 2020, Kane is still very relevant. And even though it's a movie famous for its visuals and its sound and its editing, some of the great technical advances that the movie achieves, its content and its story is still what's really interesting about it. I think any viewer can watch it and get a lot out of it, even if they know nothing about the history of movies or about cinematic techniques. Let me give you 3 reasons why Citizen Kane is still relevant and interesting. Reason number 1, Kane tells us that what we see in the media isn't even close to true. Part of the movie's opening is a newsreel that goes through and gives us a history of Charles Foster Kane's life. Kane was a famous American, a media magnate who became a rich man, a would-be political figure, and one of the best-known Americans in the world. The newsreel does a decent job of giving us a fairly complex picture of Kane from his youth to his old age. But the movie itself shows us that the newsreel is partly full of hogwash. I mean, it doesn't get to the truth about who Charles Foster Kane was at all. The minute the newsreel is over, you go into a dark, smoky room filled with people you don't know. It's an atmosphere of uncertainty and ambiguity, and these are actually journalists, news reporters who want to go find out more about Kane's life. In fact, they want to go find out about the dying word on his lips, Rosebud, and what Rosebud meant to him. So one journalist tries to track down Rosebud in an attempt to unlock the secrets of Kane's life. Who was he? What was he? Maybe Rosebud will give them everything they need to know. This search for the truth about an individual just results in further uncertainty. The newsreel at the beginning seems to give us a clear perspective on who this man was, but the rest of the movie, the last 90 minutes of it, undercuts the newsreel, and sometimes even says the newsreel was kind of wrong. Reason number 2, the news media deliberately creates untruths and sensationalizes real events. So Citizen Kane is about a man who had a fortune and decided to go into the media business. Charles Foster Kane, circa 1900, starts a newspaper and is fine with losing $1 million a year on it.
If I don't look after the interests of the underprivileged, maybe somebody else will. Maybe somebody without any money or property.
Yes.
And that would
money
be too
and property.
bad.
Well, I happened to see your financial statement today, Charles.
Oh, did you?
Now, tell me honestly, my boy, don't you think it's rather unwise to continue this philanthropic enterprise? This inquirer that's costing you $1 million a year?
You're right, Mr. Thatcher. I did lose $1 million last year. I expect to lose $1 million this year. I expect to lose $1 million next year. You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
That was big money back then, of course, but he doesn't care because, as he says, he can go on for decades without going bankrupt. We see in the various scenes where Kane is a young man running a newspaper that he's trying to build a media empire. And to do so, he does some very unscrupulous things. Probably the most unscrupulous thing he does is to start the Spanish-American War.
Galleons of Spain off Jersey coast. Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this armada's off the Jersey
Hello,
coast.
Mr. Bernstein.
Excuse me, Mr.
Can you
Kane.
prove it isn't?
This is based on real life, and the movie Citizen Kane is based on William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was even alive when Orson Welles made this movie and was royally ticked off at how Welles treated him. But the truth that news media actually starts wars and, in a way, roots for wars is part of American history. I mean, news media is an entertainment business, and it matters when the news is so important you have to look at it. What could be more important than a huge war involving American troops many of whom we know or are related to. And so we pay attention when there are wars in the news. Wars are sensationalistic. They sell newspapers, they sell videos, they increase TV ratings sometimes. This is what Charles Foster Kane knows, and that's why he's part of starting the Spanish-American War. Later in the movie, Charles Foster Kane uses his media empire to create an opera star out of his second wife, Susan Alexander. He takes her from being an ordinary woman who nobody knows, and he tries to make her great. The movie shows that she can't sing very well. I mean, she sings decently well, it's just not operatic quality. Kane tries to use the influence and persuasion of the media to make her seem great. He thinks he can make her great even though she isn't. And that's part of the idea of this movie, that media hypes things, media influences us, even when things are untrue, they can create truths out of untruths. The third reason why Kane is still a great and interesting movie. The movie really shows us 5 perspectives on Charles Foster Kane, none of which are the same. Every single person has their own version of Kane based on their own biases and experiences with him. The movie tells the story of Kane's life, and you think you get a complete picture of it, but actually what you get are 5 different perspectives that are sometimes jarring and are necessarily fragmentary. You never really see Kane as he is in this movie. You always see him filtered through somebody else's vision or bias or perspective. I've already mentioned the newsreel in this movie. That's the first perspective. The second is a banker named Thatcher. He was Kane's caretaker from Kane's youth. And when he tells his story about Kane through a written account, he calls Kane reckless. He thinks Kane is a small-time operator. Kane is younger than Thatcher, and Thatcher thinks of him as a little man or a little child. But then you jump to the next character who talks about Kane, and that's his friend Bernstein. Bernstein is Kane's peer and contemporary, and they were friends in their youth when Kane was starting the newspaper. Bernstein is really in love with Kane. He thinks the best of him. He admires Kane wildly, as shown in the portrait right behind him. He tells rosy stories about Kane's youth and how the newspaper became a startup and how the 3 young men, Kane, Bernstein, and Leland, all joined in an enterprise that was at once joyous and fascinating and robust. But then you move from the great admirer Bernstein to the other friend, Jedediah Leland. Leland was also part of the initial newspaper startup that Kane founded, but Leland is a political progressive, an idealist, and he became a drama critic. So he tells about Kane's life from the perspective of a drama critic, and from his own political perspective. He thinks Kane has betrayed political principles rooted in some kind of progressive idealism. Leland is the one who gets to tell the story about Kane trying to run for governor of New York, but failing because he looked like he was having an affair with Susan Alexander. Now, he wasn't having an affair per se with her, he was going over to her apartment. Kane was going to win the governorship and install all these progressive ideals that Leland loved, and yet Kane betrayed that cause. Then Leland criticizes Kane for trying to make Susan Alexander an opera star through his news media influence. Leland's version of Kane is very melodramatic and based on the fact that Kane fired Leland. I mean, if you told a story about your boss's life, how biased would you be if that boss fired you? And yet, if you were the best friend of a person like Bernstein, wouldn't you tell rosy stories about that person? That's the difference between Bernstein and Leland's stories. The fifth perspective on Kane is Susan Alexander, Kane's second wife. She's seen him in his older age, the last half of his life. That's when he was a grumpy, isolated man stuck in his mansion that he created, Xanadu. Susan, as we said, was kind of a pawn for Kane's schemes to become a great opera star and to create opera houses. Susan feels used and then betrayed and abandoned. She shows Kane as a pathetic old man. Oh, and then there's a last perspective, the butler at Xanadu. When the journalist in the end goes to Xanadu, he talks to the butler very briefly about what Kane was like. And then, of course, the last thing we see is Rosebud. So it turns out we have all these perspectives on Kane, but we never really get to the man as he is. And that's part of the idea. Maybe we never can. Those people we think we know in the news media, whether presidents, celebrities, various politicians, or athletes. Can you ever know who they are? Everything we see about them is filtered through certain perspectives. These perspectives are more interesting for the observers, the ones who are telling the story. We get to see their biases and their vision of reality more than we see the actual thing we're talking about, such as Kane. So in this movie, I feel like I get to know Leland and Bernstein and Thatcher a lot more than I get to know Kane. Anyway, the whole point is, Citizen Kane is about media influence in the modern world, and the various ways we can try to encounter people or events via news media. As you know, if you look at one news media website from one perspective, they look at an event in one way. Look at a different news media outlet and they see it in a totally different way. Right now we've got multiple views of the same event in news media and it's hard to know what exactly the truth is. Well, guess what? That's what Citizen Kane is about. So I encourage you to go watch this movie and write back to me. We could do a lot of videos on this, but I think this information is all you need to know to at least enjoy a movie that I think is still great and worth pursuing. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate anything you write to me or any comment you give to me. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.